I never thought I would end up in a legal battle with my own neighbors. But the moment that certified letter arrived from the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association demanding $3,000 for road maintenance, I knew my peaceful life in rural Colorado was about to get a whole lot more complicated. My name is Keith Forrester, and I had moved to this beautiful property outside Boulder about 8 months prior. The house sat on 5 acres of gorgeous land with mountain views that made every sunrise worth waking up for. I had bought the place from an elderly gentleman named Robert Chen who had lived there for 40 years. The property was perfect, the price was right, and I thought I had finally found my slice of paradise away from the chaos of city life. What I didn't know was that the previous owner had been carefully keeping a secret that would soon become my greatest asset. The letter was sitting in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon when I got home from work. I ran a small software consulting business from home, which was one of the reasons I loved this property so much. The envelope was thick, official-looking, and had that distinctive smell of laser printer toner that government documents always seem to have. I opened it while walking up my driveway, and what I read nearly made me trip over my own feet. Dear Mr. Forrester, as per the Meadowbrook Heights HOA bylaws, Section 14, subsection C, all residents are required to contribute to the annual road maintenance fund. Your property benefits from Pinecrest Lane, and therefore you owe $3,000 for resurfacing and maintenance scheduled for this spring. Payment is due within 30 days or late fees will apply. I stood there reading and rereading the letter, feeling my blood pressure rise with each pass. When I had purchased the property, nobody had mentioned anything about an HOA. I had specifically asked about it during the buying process because I wanted nothing to do with those kinds of organizations. I had heard too many horror stories from friends about power-hungry board members making people's lives miserable over paint colors and mailbox styles. I walked into my house and immediately pulled out all my closing documents. I spent the next 2 hours going through every single page, every disclosure, every addendum. There was absolutely no mention of a homeowners association anywhere. No bylaws, no dues, no restrictions. Nothing. I felt a small sense of relief, thinking this must be some kind of mistake, but I knew I would have to deal with it head-on. The next morning, I called the number listed on the letter. A woman answered on the 3rd ring with a voice that could cut glass. Meadowbrook Heights HOA, this is Margaret speaking. Hi, my name is Keith Forrester. I received a letter yesterday about road maintenance fees, and I think there has been some kind of mistake. No mistake, Mr. Forrester. All residents on Pinecrest Lane are required to contribute. It is in the bylaws. Well, that is the thing, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. I am not part of your HOA. There was no mention of it when I purchased my property, and I have no obligation to pay these fees. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear her bristling through the phone. Mr. Forrester, just because you choose to ignore your obligations does not mean they do not exist. The previous owner, Mr. Chen, was part of this association, and those obligations transfer with the property. I would love to see the documentation showing that I am part of this HOA, I said, because I have all my closing documents right here, and there is nothing about it. I will have our president contact you, Margaret said curtly. But I assure you, this fee is mandatory and we will pursue legal action if necessary. She hung up before I could respond. I sat there staring at my phone, equal parts annoyed and amused. These people clearly did not know who they were dealing with. I had spent years working in tech, dealing with contracts and legal documents, and I was not about to be bullied into paying for something I did not owe. 3 days later, I got another call. This time it was from a woman who introduced herself as Denise Patterson, the HOA president. Her voice had that particular quality that certain middle-aged women develop when they have spent too much time in positions of minor authority. Sweet on the surface, but with an underlying edge that suggested she was used to getting her way. "Mr. Forrester, I understand there has been some confusion about your HOA obligations." "No confusion on my end," I replied. "I am simply not part of your HOA." "Well, that is where you are mistaken. Your property is located on Pinecrest Lane, which is maintained by our association. You use the road, therefore you must contribute to its upkeep. It is only fair." "Mrs. Patterson, fairness aside, I need to see legal documentation that I am actually part of your association. When I purchased this property, there were no HOA disclosures, no CC and Articus, nothing. As far as I am concerned, I am not obligated to pay you anything." I heard her take a deep breath, the kind people take when they are trying very hard not to lose their temper. "Mr. Forrester, we have been maintaining that road for 15 years. Every property owner contributes. Just because you were not properly informed does not mean you can skip out on your responsibilities. Then it sounds like you need to take that up with whoever failed to properly inform me during the purchase. But that is not my problem." "We will send you the bylaws and documentation," she said, her voice getting tighter. "And I expect payment within the 30-day window. Otherwise, we will place a lien on your property." "You do what you need to do," I said. "But I would be very careful about placing liens on properties for obligations that do not legally exist." After that call, I decided it was time to do some serious research. I spent the next week digging through county records, property deeds, and every document I could find about Pinecrest Lane and the surrounding properties. What I found was absolutely fascinating. The road itself, Pinecrest Lane, was not a public road maintained by the county. It was a private road, which I had known when I purchased the property. What I had not known, and what turned out to be the most important detail of all, was exactly who owned that private road. I found the deed buried in the county records, a document that dated back to 1967. The road had been built by a small developer who had subdivided a large parcel of land into several lots. According to the original deed, the road was to be maintained by an easement held by the property owners who used it. Pretty standard stuff for private roads in rural areas. But then I found something else. In 1983, there had been a transfer of the actual road ownership. The developer had sold it to a single individual before selling off the final lots, and that individual was Robert Chen, the man I had bought my property from. I felt my heart start to race as I kept reading. Chen had owned the road itself, not just an easement to use it. The other property owners had easements allowing them to use the road, but they did not own it. And when I had purchased Chen's property, I had purchased everything he owned, including the road deed. I actually laughed out loud in the county clerk's office, earning a strange look from the woman behind the desk. I now owned the private road that the HOA was trying to charge me to maintain. This changed everything. I immediately called my real estate attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia who had helped me with the property purchase. I explained the situation, and she requested copies of all the documents I had found. 2 days later, she called me back, and I could hear the amusement in her voice. "Keith, you are not going to believe this, but you are absolutely right. You own that road. The deed is clear, and it was properly transferred to you at closing. The HOA has no authority over it whatsoever." So what does this mean exactly? It means that not only do you not owe them any money, but they actually need your permission to do any maintenance on it at all. They have been acting as though they own and control this road for years, but legally, it is yours. Can they just claim ownership through adverse possession or something? In Colorado, adverse possession requires 20 years of continuous, open, and hostile use. Even if they started maintaining it 15 years ago like they claim, they have not hit that threshold. Plus, if the previous owner gave them permission, it was not hostile use, which is a requirement. You are in the clear. I thanked Patricia and hung up, my mind racing with possibilities. I was not the kind of person who enjoyed conflict, but I also was not going to let these people push me around. I decided to take a more diplomatic approach first. I drafted a formal letter to the HOA, outlining my findings and explaining that I owned the road. I offered to allow them to continue using it with no issues, as long as they acknowledged my ownership and stopped trying to charge me fees. I thought it was a reasonable solution. They could keep using the road, I would not charge them anything, and we could all move on with our lives. The response I got was not what I expected. 4 days after I sent my letter, Denise Patterson showed up at my front door unannounced. She was exactly what I had pictured. Late 50s, blonde hair with dark roots showing, wearing a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, and carrying a Kate Spade purse that she clutched like a weapon. "Mr. Forrester, we need to talk," she said the moment I opened the door. "Okay, would you like to come in? This won't take long. Your ridiculous claim that you own Pinecrest Lane is absurd and frankly insulting. That road has been maintained by our association for 15 years, and we have every right to continue doing so. Mrs. Patterson, I have the deed. The road was transferred to me when I purchased the property. This isn't a claim, it is a legal fact." Her face was turning red now, and I could see a vein starting to pulse in her forehead. Robert Chen never said anything about owning the road. We have been maintaining it for years with contributions from everyone. Then Mr. Chen was allowing you to maintain it, which was generous of him. But the ownership is clear. I am happy to continue allowing access, but I am not paying you to maintain something I own. "This is extortion," she hissed. "You are trying to hold the entire neighborhood hostage." "Actually, I am trying to resolve this reasonably. You are the one who started this by demanding money I do not owe. We will see what our lawyer has to say about this." She turned on her heel and marched back to her black Mercedes SUV, nearly hitting my mailbox as she backed out of my driveway too fast. I knew then that this was going to get ugly before it got better. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I received a letter from a law firm in Boulder representing the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. It was full of legal language basically saying that my claim was unfounded, that the HOA had established rights to the road through maintenance and use, and that if I did not pay the assessment, they would pursue all legal remedies available. I forwarded the letter to Patricia, who sent back a response that was polite but firm. She laid out the legal ownership of the road, cited the relevant property law, and suggested that the HOA might want to reconsider their position before wasting everyone's time and money on litigation they could not win. That was when things started to get weird. I began noticing cars driving slowly past my house at odd hours. My trash cans, which I left by the road for pickup, were knocked over twice in 1 week. Someone filed a complaint with the county about my property, claiming I was running an illegal business, which resulted in an inspector showing up to check out my home office. The inspector found nothing wrong, of course, but it was clear someone was trying to make my life difficult. The final straw came when I found a notice taped to my front door, stating that the HOA board had voted to revoke my access to Pinecrest Lane for non-payment of dues and hostile actions toward the association. They were actually trying to prevent me from using the road that I owned to access my own property. That was when I decided to stop playing nice. I called Patricia and told her I wanted to flip this situation around. If I owned the road, and everyone else just had easements to use it, then I should be able to charge them for that use, right? She confirmed that yes, as the owner of a private road, I had the right to charge reasonable fees for its maintenance and use, as long as I did not prevent access entirely, which would violate their easement rights. We drafted a formal notice to all the property owners who used Pinecrest Lane, about 12 houses in total. The notice explained that I was the legal owner of the road, provided copies of the deed as proof, and outlined a new arrangement. Each household would pay me an annual road maintenance fee of $500. This was significantly less than the $3,000 they had tried to charge me, and I would take on the responsibility of actually maintaining the road properly. I also made it clear that this was not optional. They had easements to use the road, but those easements came with the implied responsibility to contribute to maintenance. If they refused, I would pursue legal action to enforce the terms. The response was immediate and explosive. My phone started ringing off the hook. Some people were confused, some were angry, and a few actually seemed relieved. One neighbor, an older man named Tom who lived 3 houses down, actually stopped by to thank me. "I have been paying that HOA for years," he said, "and I have never seen them do a damn thing with the money. The road is full of potholes, and they keep saying they will fix it but never do. If you are actually going to maintain it, I am happy to pay you instead." But Tom was in the minority. Most of the other residents were firmly on the HOA's side, mostly because Denise Patterson had spent the last few weeks telling everyone that I was trying to steal the road and extort them for money. 3 days after I sent out my notices, I got a knock on my door at 8 in the morning. I opened it to find 2 sheriff's deputies standing on my porch, looking uncomfortable. "Keith Forrester," one of them asked. "That is me. We have received a complaint from the Meadowbrook Heights HOA that you are blocking access to a private road and attempting to extort money from residents." I actually laughed, which probably was not the best response. "Officers, I own that road. I have the deed right here if you would like to see it. The HOA has been trying to charge me for maintenance on a road I own, and now that I have started charging reasonable fees to actually maintain it, they are claiming it is extortion." I invited them in and showed them all the documentation. They looked through everything, made some notes, and the older of the 2 deputies shook his head with a slight smile. "This is a civil matter, sir. We cannot do anything about it. You will have to work this out through the courts or between yourselves. But for what it is worth, it looks like you have your paperwork in order." After they left, I knew this was going to end up in court. The HOA was not going to back down, and neither was I. Sure enough, 1 month later, I was served with a lawsuit. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA was suing me for harassment, attempting to illegally collect fees, interfering with their established rights to the road, and emotional distress. They were seeking an injunction to prevent me from charging any fees, plus damages of $50,000. I will be honest, seeing that lawsuit was intimidating. Even though I knew I was legally in the right, the thought of going through a court battle was exhausting. But Patricia was confident, and she immediately filed a countersuit on my behalf for harassment, attempted fraud in trying to charge me for services on property I owned, and to formally establish my ownership rights to the road. The case took 8 months to work its way through the system. During that time, life in the neighborhood became increasingly tense. Denise Patterson organized a petition to try to get the county to take over the road, which went nowhere. She posted on the neighborhood Facebook page almost daily about what a terrible person I was. She even tried to organize a blockade of my driveway, but most people thought that was going too far and it never materialized. Through all of this, I kept meticulous records. Every interaction, every incident, every piece of mail. Patricia told me that documentation would be crucial, and she was right. The first hearing was mostly procedural, but it gave me a sense of what we were up against. The HOA's lawyer was a slick guy in an expensive suit who seemed to think he could win through intimidation and fancy rhetoric. He argued that the HOA had established rights through years of maintenance, and that my claims were simply an attempt to profit off my neighbors. Patricia calmly presented the deed, the chain of ownership, and expert testimony from a property law professor who explained exactly why my ownership was clear and unambiguous. The judge listened carefully, asked a few pointed questions, and scheduled a full trial for 3 months later. During those 3 months, the HOA made several settlement offers. First, they offered to drop their lawsuit if I dropped mine and agreed not to charge any fees. I declined. Then they offered to acknowledge my ownership if I agreed to transfer maintenance responsibilities to them at no cost. I declined again. Finally, they offered to pay me $1,000 total as a one-time acknowledgement of my ownership if I agreed never to charge fees in the future. I declined that too. Patricia advised me that we were in a strong position and that we should push for a complete victory. I trusted her judgment. The trial itself was almost anticlimactic. The HOA's lawyer tried every argument he could think of. He claimed that Robert Chen had verbally agreed to give up ownership of the road, which he could not prove. He claimed that adverse possession applied, which Patricia demolished by pointing out the timeline and the lack of hostile use. He even tried to argue that it was against public policy to allow one person to own a road that others depended on, which the judge shut down immediately by noting that private roads with single owners were common and perfectly legal. Our case was straightforward. We had the deed. We had the chain of ownership. We had expert testimony. The HOA had nothing but bluster and indignation. The judge took 2 weeks to issue his ruling, and when it came, it was everything I had hoped for. He ruled that I was the unambiguous owner of Pinecrest Lane, that the HOA had no authority over it whatsoever, and that I had every right to charge reasonable maintenance fees to the other property owners who used it. He dismissed all of the HOA's claims against me and awarded me attorney's fees, which came to just over $30,000. But the ruling went even further. The judge found that the HOA had acted in bad faith by continuing to press their claims even after being presented with clear evidence of my ownership. He specifically called out Denise Patterson by name for her harassment campaign and warned that any future frivolous legal action would result in sanctions. I sat in the courtroom feeling a wave of relief wash over me. It was finally over, or so I thought. 2 days after the ruling, I received a check from the HOA for the attorney's fees. It came with no note, no apology, nothing. Just a check. I deposited it immediately, half expecting them to try to stop payment out of spite. Then I got to work actually doing what I had promised, maintaining the road. I hired a local paving company to fill all the potholes and seal the surface. I installed better drainage on the sides to prevent water damage. I even put up nice reflective markers along the edges for safety at night. The total cost was about $8,000, which meant even after paying for the work, I was still ahead thanks to the attorney's fees. I sent out new invoices to all the property owners, along with a copy of the court ruling. Most people paid without complaint. A few grumbled but sent checks anyway. Denise Patterson was one of the last holdouts. 3 weeks after everyone else had paid, I sent her a certified letter reminding her that payment was overdue and that I would pursue legal action if necessary. The check arrived 2 days later, but it came with a handwritten note that just said, "This is not over." I showed the note to Patricia, and she advised me to keep it as evidence of continued harassment but not to engage further. The court had ruled I had won, and anything Denise did now was just the death throes of a lost cause. Life in the neighborhood slowly started to normalize. People stopped giving me dirty looks when I drove past. The Facebook posts from Denise became less frequent and then stopped altogether. Tom, the older neighbor who had supported me from the beginning, even organized a small barbecue and invited me, which felt like a real turning point. At the barbecue, several neighbors apologized for how they had treated me. They explained that Denise had convinced them I was trying to take advantage of everyone, and they had believed her because she was the HOA president and seemed to know what she was talking about. Once the court ruling came out and they saw the actual facts, they realized they had been misled. One woman named Jennifer, who lived at the far end of the road, actually thanked me for taking over maintenance. Honestly, we were paying way more to the HOA and the road was getting worse every year. I think they were just pocketing most of the money. This is so much better. That comment got me thinking. If the HOA had been collecting money for road maintenance for 15 years, and the road had been in terrible condition when I took over, where had all that money gone? I started asking around carefully, not wanting to stir up more trouble but genuinely curious. What I learned was disturbing. The HOA collected about $3,000 per household per year, which for 12 households came to $36,000 annually. Over 15 years, that was over $500,000, even accounting for households that might not have paid every year. But according to everyone I talked to, the road had been resurfaced exactly once in those 15 years, about 7 years ago, and it had been a cheap job that started falling apart within 2 years. Even being generous, that resurfacing probably cost $20,000 at most. So where was the other $480,000? I mentioned this to Tom one afternoon when he stopped by to drop off some tomatoes from his garden. His face got serious. "You know, I have wondered about that too. The HOA always says the money goes to road maintenance and community expenses, but we don't have any community facilities. No pool, no clubhouse, nothing. Just the road. And the road has been garbage for years. Who handles the HOA finances?" I asked. "Denise Patterson and her treasurer, a woman named Carol. They are the only ones who have access to the accounts. They present a budget at the annual meeting, but it is always vague. Just line items like road maintenance and administrative costs with no real detail." That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about all that money and where it might have gone. I was not sure if I should get involved. The lawsuit was over, I had won, and the smart thing to do was probably to just move on with my life. But the thought of Denise and Carol potentially stealing from people for 15 years really bothered me. The next day, I called Patricia and asked her advice. She was hesitant at first, warning me that I could be opening another can of worms. But when I explained the numbers and the lack of any visible spending, she agreed it was suspicious enough to warrant looking into. "If you want to pursue this, you would need some of the other HOA members to request a formal audit of the books. As a property owner who uses the road, you might have standing to request it yourself, even though you are not technically part of the HOA anymore. Let me do some research." 2 days later, Patricia called me back with interesting news. Under Colorado law, Members of a homeowners association had the right to inspect the association's financial records. Even though the court had ruled that I was not subject to the HOA's authority, I technically had never formally withdrawn from the association, which meant I might still be considered a member for purposes of access to records. We drafted a formal request for all financial records from the past 15 years, including bank statements, receipts for services, and documentation of any expenditures. We sent it to Denise Patterson via certified mail with a deadline of 30 days. The response was predictably hostile. Denise sent a letter back claiming that I had forfeited my membership rights by refusing to pay dues and challenging the HOA in court. She refused to provide any records. That was a mistake on her part. Patricia filed a motion with the court to compel the HOA to produce the records, arguing that, as someone who had been charged fees and sued by the organization, I had a legitimate interest in seeing how the money was being used. The judge agreed and ordered the HOA to turn over all financial documents within 2 weeks. When the documents finally arrived, they were a mess. 15 years of bank statements, receipts, and handwritten ledgers that looked like they had been kept by someone with no accounting training whatsoever. Patricia and I spent hours going through everything, and what we found was damning. Over the course of 15 years, the HOA had collected approximately $540,000 in road maintenance fees. Of that amount, less than $50,000 could be documented as actually being spent on road maintenance. The rest had been paid out in dozens of checks made out to cash, or to Denise Patterson personally for administrative expenses and reimbursements. There were checks for things like office supplies for $300, community research for $500, and consultant fees for $1,000. There were regular monthly payments to Denise of $500 labeled as management fees. All told, over $400,000 had been paid directly to Denise or withdrawn as cash over the years. Carol, the treasurer, had also received regular payments, though smaller ones. About $50,000 had gone to her over the years for bookkeeping services. We kept digging and found even more. Denise had used HOA funds to pay for personal expenses that she had tried to disguise as business costs. There were receipts for dinners at expensive restaurants labeled as board meetings, where she was the only board member present. There were charges for a weekend trip to Aspen labeled as a HOA conference that we could not find any record of actually existing. This was not just financial mismanagement. This was embezzlement, fraud, and theft on a massive scale. I sat back in my chair, feeling a mix of anger and vindication. Denise Patterson had spent months trying to destroy my reputation, harassing me and dragging me through court, all while she had been stealing from the very people she claimed to represent. Patricia looked at me seriously. "Keith, this is criminal. We need to report this to the authorities." "Are you sure? I mean, I know it looks bad, but what if there are explanations for some of this?" "There might be explanations for a few questionable expenses, but this is a pattern of systematic theft over 15 years. No legitimate explanation covers this. And more importantly, if we know about this and don't report it, we could potentially be seen as complicit." She was right. We compiled all the evidence into a comprehensive report and submitted it to the Boulder County District Attorney's Office along with a formal complaint. We also sent copies to every property owner in the neighborhood who had been paying HOA dues. The reaction was explosive. People were furious. Several of them had paid those fees for the entire 15 years, which meant they had each been defrauded of over $40,000. Even the people who had been most loyal to Denise turned on her when they saw the evidence. Within 2 days, The entire HOA board had resigned. The remaining members held an emergency meeting and voted to formally dissolve the association entirely. Without the road maintenance justification, there was no reason for it to exist anymore. The criminal investigation took 3 months. During that time, Denise Patterson hired a very expensive criminal defense attorney and tried to argue that all the payments had been legitimate expenses and that she had approval from the board for everything. The problem was that she was the board president, and Carol, the treasurer, was the only other person with consistent board access. They had essentially been approving their own payments with no oversight. The district attorney's office was thorough. They brought in forensic accountants who traced every dollar. They interviewed every property owner who had paid dues. They subpoenaed Denise's personal bank records and found that the timing of deposits into her accounts matched up perfectly with the cash withdrawals and payments from the HOA. In November, Denise Patterson and Carol were both arrested and charged with multiple counts of theft, embezzlement, and fraud. The amounts involved meant these were felony charges with potential prison time. I watched the news coverage of their arrest with mixed feelings. Part of me was satisfied to see them face consequences for what they had done. But another part of me felt sad that it had come to this. These were people who had been part of this community for years, and they had thrown it all away for money. The court case moved relatively quickly by criminal standards. Both women tried to negotiate plea deals, but the DA's office was not interested in being lenient. The evidence was too strong, and the amounts involved were too large. The trial lasted 2 weeks. I was called as a witness to explain how I had discovered the financial irregularities. I testified about the documents I had reviewed and the analysis we had done. Denise's lawyer tried to paint me as someone with an axe to grind, but it was hard to argue with the bank records and receipts. In the end, both women were convicted on all counts. Denise Patterson was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution of $400,000. Carol received 4 years and was ordered to pay back $50,000. Both sentences could be reduced with good behavior, but they were going to prison regardless. The sentencing hearing was difficult to watch. Denise stood before the judge and finally broke down, crying and apologizing and claiming she had never meant for it to go so far. She said it had started small, just taking a little extra for the work she was doing, and then it had gotten out of control. The judge was unmoved, pointing out that this was not a momentary lapse in judgment but a calculated pattern of theft spanning 15 years. After the sentencing, several of the neighbors approached me to thank me for uncovering the fraud. Jennifer, the woman who had thanked me at the barbecue, was in tears. My husband and I paid those fees for 12 years. That was over $36,000. We were saving up to redo our kitchen, and we kept putting it off because money was tight. And the whole time, Denise was just stealing from us. The restitution process was complicated. Both women had spent most of the money they had taken, so getting it back was going to be difficult. The court placed liens on their properties and would garnish their wages once they were released from prison. But it would take years for people to get their money back if they ever got it all. Through all of this, I kept maintaining Pinecrest Lane. I had committed to doing it properly, and I meant to keep that commitment. The $500 per year I was charging was more than enough to cover basic maintenance, and the road stayed in good condition. When winter came, I even hired a plow service to keep it clear of snow, which was something the HOA had never done consistently. Life gradually returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. The neighborhood was actually friendlier without the HOA creating divisions. People started organizing informal get-togethers and helping each other out without needing an official organization to coordinate everything. Tom became one of my closest friends. We would get together most weekends to watch football or work on projects around our properties. He told me once that the whole situation had been the most exciting thing to happen in the neighborhood in decades, which made me laugh. One evening in late spring, about a year after the initial letter that had started everything, I was sitting on my back porch watching the sunset over the mountains. My phone rang, and I saw it was Patricia. "Hey, I have some news you might find interesting," she said. "Remember how Denise was ordered to pay restitution?" "Yeah, though I figured most people would never see that money." "Well, her lawyer has been working on a repayment plan. They are selling her house and using the proceeds to make a lump sum payment toward what she owes. You are on the list to receive a payment." "Wait, what? I never paid HOA dues. Why would I get restitution?" "Actually, you did pay in a way. The attorney's fees you incurred defending yourself against their frivolous lawsuit. The judge ruled that those fees were a direct result of Denise's fraudulent activity and attempts to cover up the financial irregularities. You are entitled to compensation for that." "How much are we talking about?" "Looks like about $12,000. It is not the full amount you spent on legal fees, but it is a significant chunk." I hung up the phone feeling stunned. I had never expected to see any of that money again. The $30,000 in legal fees the HOA had paid after the initial ruling had covered most of my costs, but there had still been expenses related to the fraud investigation and everything that followed. Getting $12,000 back was a pleasant surprise. When the check arrived a month later, I decided to do something meaningful with it. I used part of it to install proper LED street lighting along Pinecrest Lane. The road had always been dark at night, which made it dangerous during the winter months. The lights made a huge difference, and every neighbor thanked me for it. I used the rest to set up a small emergency fund for road repairs. I kept it in a separate account, transparent and documented, the complete opposite of how Denise had managed things. If we ever needed major work done, the money would be there. 2 years after this all began, I found myself in almost exactly the same spot where it started, standing by my mailbox, looking at the mountains, grateful for this property and this life I had built. But everything had changed. I had gone from being a newcomer who just wanted to be left alone to being an integral part of this small community. The road I maintained was in the best condition it had been in 20 years. The neighbors actually knew each other and helped each other out. And the toxic presence of an unaccountable HOA board was gone, replaced by people just trying to live their lives and be good neighbors. I thought about that first letter demanding $3,000 and how angry it had made me. At the time, I had seen it as nothing but a hassle and an injustice. But in a weird way, it had led to something positive. It had exposed fraud, brought a community together, and taught me that standing up for what is right sometimes leads to unexpected consequences. Tom pulled up in his truck, honking and waving. We were supposed to go fishing that afternoon, something we did most weekends now. As I walked over to join him, I thought about everything that had happened and realized I would not change any of it. Well, maybe I would have skipped the part where Denise tried to block my driveway and the angry phone calls and the months of legal stress. But the outcome was worth it. "You ready to catch some trout?" Tom asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. "Absolutely." "Think they are biting today?" "Only one way to find out." As we drove down Pinecrest Lane, the smooth pavement beneath us, the new lights standing ready for nightfall, I felt something I had not felt in a long time, completely at peace. I owned a beautiful property in the Colorado mountains. I had good friends, and I had learned that sometimes the biggest headaches lead to the best outcomes. The road that had caused so much conflict had become a symbol of something better. It was well maintained, fairly managed, and belonged to someone who actually cared about doing right by the people who used it. And every time Denise Patterson made a payment toward her restitution from her prison commissary account or through wage garnishment after her release, it would serve as a reminder that fraud and dishonesty eventually catch up with you. I never did join another HOA, and I never will. But I learned that community does not need bureaucracy and boards and bylaws to function. Sometimes it just needs people who are willing to do the right thing, stand up when something is wrong, and work together. The fishing that afternoon was excellent. Tom and I caught our limit, fried them up at his place, and spent the evening telling stories and laughing about the absurdity of everything that had happened. His wife Susan joined us, and at one point she raised her beer in a toast. To Keith, the man who owned the road and made everyone pay him instead. We all laughed and clinked our bottles together, and I thought about how that sentence would have sounded insane to me 2 years ago. But now it was just a fact, a piece of history, and the beginning of something better than what had come before. The next morning, I woke up to a beautiful Colorado sunrise and got to work. I had a conference call with a client at 9. Then I needed to review some code for a project I was consulting on. Normal life, normal work, exactly what I had wanted when I moved here. Around noon, I took a break and walked down to check the mailbox. There was the usual assortment of bills and junk mail, but nothing from any HOA. Nothing demanding money I did not owe, nothing threatening liens or legal action. Just regular mail, blissfully boring and conflict-free. I walked back up my driveway, looking at my house and my property and the mountains beyond, and felt grateful for every single thing that had happened. The struggle had been worth it. Standing my ground had been worth it. And now, I had something that too many people never get. A home that was truly mine, free from the interference of petty bureaucrats and corrupt officials. Pinecrest Lane stretched out behind me, solid and well-maintained. A testament to the idea that doing things right might take more effort, but it pays off in the end. And somewhere in a prison in Colorado, Denise Patterson was learning that same lesson the hard way, one day at a time, for the next several years. I went back inside, poured myself a cup of coffee, and got back to work. Life was good. The road was mine. And justice, delayed though it might have been, had finally been served.